Hi everybody, today we're going to talk about the difference between independent and dependent variables and how you can tell. Now, of course, scientists generally are interested in variability, in other words, why things are different from each other on a single variable. Social science researchers, for example, are especially interested in why people differ on certain things. Psychologists, for example, might be interested in why people are different in intelligence. Why is there a difference in IQ between you and me and from your neighbor and things like that? It could also be a million other things. For example, why do we have different musical aptitudes? Why do we have different musical preferences, for example? Why do we have different interests, right? So these are all sorts of things that can vary among the units that we are measuring, in this particular case, humans. Okay, so these things that can vary are called variables. We've already covered that before, but I want to just remind you really quickly. So anything that can vary in its value across the units you measure is called a variable. So there are, of course, millions of variables that we could test. And in statistical tests, what we're usually interested in is trying to account for the variability in that variable. In fact, most statistical tests you could summarize essentially as this. We're taking the statistic, whatever we've got, maybe the correlation, for example, or a t-test that we haven't covered yet, but we will. And it's essentially in the numerator of that test, we're looking at the variation that we can account for, or the variation in the variable that we can actually explain. And then what that's divided by is the variation that we can't explain, that it's just unaccounted for in this particular test. That's essentially every statistical test that we have. That's what the equation essentially looks like and is trying to get at. Now, of course, it's important to know which variable is affecting the other variable as well. Now, you'll recall in a correlation, we can't do that, right? We don't know which variable is affecting the other one. It's not designed that way. It's not set up to be able to do that kind of thing. Unless in your design, you sort of chronologically ensured that one variable became before the other, then you can sort of surmise that, except with the other caveats that we explain. However, in most research, we have a pretty good ability to determine which variable is influencing which other variable. And so we have different words for these kinds of variables. The variable that we think is doing the influencing is called the independent variable. Okay, so for example, if I want to test whether caffeine influences alertness, then caffeine would be my independent variable. In other words, it's something that I don't think I'm influencing, I'm just introducing to the study. So it is therefore independent of the other variables in the study. Although the name is a little controversial, I'll say, but we call it the independent variable. Okay, so now independent variables sometimes are difficult to identify in a study. So if I were just to present to you some different kind of study descriptions, sometimes it's difficult to pinpoint which one is the independent variable, especially in complex studies that have multiple variables throughout them. But we're going to try to give you some guiding principles to help you understand that. So for example, one pretty clear sign that it's an independent variable is if the researcher manipulates the variable itself. If the researcher manipulates that variable, that's probably the independent variable, or at least one of them. If the researcher is introducing the variable into the study, in other words, it's something that wouldn't normally be occurring in that sample, then the researcher is introducing it, that's a pretty good sign that it's also an independent variable. For example, if I were to just introduce caffeine to some rats to see what happens with them, then caffeine pretty clearly is going to be the independent variable there. All right. And now it's an important caveat that it doesn't mean I have to be doing these as the researcher for it to be the independent variable. But if you see those two elements there, that's a pretty good sign that it is the independent variable. You can, however, have independent variables that I didn't manipulate and that I didn't introduce to the study. So I'll give you an example of that right now, actually. Let's say that I'm interested in differences between males and females on, I don't know, we'll say verbal reasoning or something. Now, I'm not introducing biological sex. I'm not introducing their chromosomal sex, for example. That's already there. I'm also not manipulating it because I can't do that. I couldn't do that ethically, right? I couldn't say to some individual, hey, I'm going to randomly assign you to be a male, right? That's just not doable. And so even though I don't introduce it and I don't manipulate it, if I think that it is biological sex that is influencing the, whatever I said, the verbal reasoning ability, it's still the independent variable, even though I can't do those two things. Okay, so you keep an eye out for that. It's really the clearest indication is if I think it is the thing that is influencing the other thing, then it's the independent variable. So of course, in contrast to the independent variable is the dependent variable. The dependent variable is the other thing. It's the thing that we think may be influenced by the independent variable. Now, it's important to also note, it's not that the researcher necessarily thinks that it is being influenced, but the researcher is testing for that possibility, okay? You don't necessarily have to have some kind of opinion as the researcher as to what is going on. Often researchers do, but you're simply testing for whether this is true, whether the dependent variable is actually changing due to the independent variable. So again, in our example of the caffeine and alertness, if caffeine is the independent variable we think is doing the changing, then the alertness would be the dependent variable, the thing that is being affected by caffeine. Okay. A really nice way to just kind of remember this is if you can simply remember this, that the independent variable is thought to influence the dependent variable, or is being tested for whether it influences the dependent variable, you're really kind of okay. If you can just kind of keep this in mind, any scenario that I read, if you just contrast it with that, you should be able to tell which is the dependent and independent variable. Although sometimes it is tricky, especially if you have multiple variables, like I said. Now, one important note here is that the dependent variable is not manipulated directly by the researcher, except for the fact that the researcher is introducing the independent variable. Okay, so the dependent variable isn't actually changed, it's simply measured by the researcher afterwards. That may be also a nice sort of metric that you can use to see if it is maybe the dependent or independent variable. For example, in rats and alertness, let's say I've got a bunch of rats and I introduce caffeine to them, right? Rats don't normally have caffeine just available to them. I'm the one introducing it into their diets. And now I simply measure their levels of alertness, probably through some behavioral metric, for example. But if I'm just measuring the alertness after I've introduced something that I've manipulated, then it's a pretty clear sign that alertness would be the dependent variable. Now let's practice some of these and see if you can identify which is the independent and dependent variable. Okay, in the first example, let's imagine that there's a researcher who's curious about whether secondhand smoke exposure causes later lung cancer, or at least influences later lung cancer risk. Okay, so first of all, identify the variables here. I'll give you a hint, there are only two, and then tell me which one's the independent and which one is the dependent variable. Pause the video if you'd like, and then right now, of course, we'll go over the answer. There are, of course, two variables here. The first is secondhand smoke exposure, and then the second one is risk of lung cancer, right? So we have these two variables here. Now, the independent variable, of course, is the secondhand smoke exposure. One of the signs here is, well, first of all, the researcher probably didn't manipulate it or introduce it, right? That would be unethical. So probably what the researcher did is went out and found people in houses where there is smoke and they're being exposed to smoke and simply said, hey, do you mind if I record some of the things going on with you? And hopefully they said yes, right? Now, even though the researcher didn't introduce secondhand smoke and didn't manipulate the levels of secondhand smoke, what they are doing is they are seeing whether it is the thing causing the change in the other variable, in the risk of lung cancer. So therefore, by definition, this would be the independent variable. And of course, as I said, the dependent variable would then be the risk of lung cancer diagnosis for the remainder of their life, or whatever the researcher decided to do. Okay, now let's try another one. In this example, the researcher wonders which therapy is more effective at treating symptoms of PTSD. So there's therapy A and therapy B. We can call them whatever we want. And which one is better at treating PTSD? So first of all, identify the variables, and then which one is the independent versus dependent variable. Pause the video. And hopefully you're back now. And of course, here we have two variables. The first variable is the therapy type. Right? It can be either therapy A or therapy B, so it's a binary variable or a dichotomous variable. And then there's PTSD levels, symptoms of PTSD, right? That's the other variable. So of course, in this case, the independent variable, the researcher is seeing whether it is the therapy level that influences the PTSD levels. So therefore, the therapy type or therapy style would be the independent variable. And of course, obviously, then the symptoms of PTSD, the levels of the symptoms, would be the dependent variable because it is thought to perhaps be affected by therapy level. Right, quick recap of what we talked about today. Statistical tests try to isolate the effects of the independent variable on the dependent variable. Now, really quickly, sometimes there are multiple independent variables in a single test, We're not going to do any of that in this particular series. That's relatively intermediate or advanced kind of statistics, so you can do that in future courses. We're just going to talk about some of the most basic kinds of tests, however. Okay, so now sometimes the researcher is able to control and manipulate the independent variable, often does introduce it, but not always. But the main indicator that it is the independent variable is that the researcher is testing whether that variable is the thing causing a change or leading to a change or affecting the other variable, the dependent variable. And the dependent variable is usually the thing that is simply measured after all of the other inputs have been there, or after all of the other variables are present. Now, of course, some statistical tests do not have an independent or dependent variable, such as the correlation, as we talked about. But pretty much everything we talk about for the rest of this series will. And again, this summary is really what you need to memorize if you have not already. The independent variable is thought to cause the change in the dependent variable, and that's pretty much it. Okay, we'll talk again soon. I'll see you next time.